Tonight, we're going to explore a paradox as old as human consciousness itself, the delicate dance between strength and vulnerability, between the fortress of the mind and the open heart. You might think that true strength means building impenetrable walls around your emotions. But what if the very attempt to become invulnerable actually makes us less human, less connected, less capable of the deep relationships that give life its richest meaning? We're diving into this ancient question through the lens of both timeless philosophy and cutting-edge psychology, following a thread that connects a former slave in ancient Rome to the therapists and neuroscientists of today. If you're enjoying these philosophical journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it allows me to keep creating these peaceful explorations for all of us who find comfort in the deeper questions. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community connect through these stories, knowing that somewhere, someone else is also settling into the quiet contemplation of what it means to be human. Now dim the lights wherever you are, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or perhaps light a candle if that helps you unwind. Let yourself ease into your most comfortable position, allowing your breathing to naturally slow as we prepare for tonight's journey. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, and let's drift into tonight's exploration of the mind's remarkable power to shape reality, and the hidden costs that power might carry. Imagine yourself walking through the gentle Mediterranean evening of ancient Rome, around the year 90 AD. The sun is setting over the 7 hills, painting the marble columns in warm amber light that seems to hold centuries of wisdom within its glow. You can hear the distant sound of water trickling through the elaborate fountain systems that Romans perfected, a constant, soothing murmur that mingles with the soft conversations of philosophers and students gathering in one of the city's many courtyards dedicated to learning. The air carries the scent of olive oil and burning lamp wicks, mixed with the faint aroma of bread from nearby kitchens and the earthy smell of the Mediterranean herbs that grow wild between the stone pathways. You find yourself drawn toward a simple but dignified building where a small group has gathered around an older man whose presence seems to command attention not through force, but through an unmistakable depth of character. This is Epictetus, though you notice immediately that he doesn't look like what you might expect from someone whose ideas would influence human thought for the next 2,000 years. He walks with a limp, the result of a leg injury from his days as a slave, and his clothing is modest, practical rather than impressive. But when he speaks, there's something in his voice that makes you understand why people travel hundreds of miles to hear his words. What strikes you most as you settle onto one of the worn stone benches, feeling the smooth coolness of the marble that has been polished by countless seekers before you, is how practical his wisdom feels. Epictetus isn't discussing abstract theories removed from daily life. He's talking about something every person in that courtyard has experienced. The way our minds can either be our greatest ally or our most persistent tormentor. You might recognize this yourself, the way a single thought can transform a perfectly pleasant day into a spiral of worry, or how shifting your perspective on a challenge can suddenly make it seem not just manageable, but even interesting. Men are disturbed not by things, Epictetus says, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, but by the views which they take of them. The sentence settles over the gathering like the gentle evening breeze, simple on the surface but somehow containing layers of meaning that seem to unfold as you consider them. You realize he's describing something profound about human nature, that we live not in the world as it is, but in the world as we interpret it, and that this interpretation is something we can learn to shape. As you listen, you begin to understand that Epictetus is teaching something that will one day be called cognitive reframing, though he would never use such clinical language. He's showing his students, former slaves like himself, wealthy Romans, curious travelers, how to recognize the difference between what happens to them and what they tell themselves about what happens to them. It's a distinction that sounds almost too simple to be revolutionary, yet you can see in the faces around you that something profound is shifting, as if people are discovering a room in their own house they never knew existed. Perhaps you felt this yourself, that moment when you realize that the story you've been telling yourself about a situation isn't the only possible story. Maybe it was recognizing that what felt like a devastating failure was actually redirecting you towards something better, or noticing that the person whose opinion you feared losing wasn't actually someone whose values aligned with your own deepest truth. Epictetus would call this the beginning of freedom, not the freedom to control what happens to you, but the much more powerful freedom to choose how you respond to what happens. There's something deeply soothing about this realization, isn't there? The recognition that while we cannot control the wind, we can adjust our sails. As you sit in that ancient courtyard, watching the lamp flames flicker in the growing dusk, you sense that you're witnessing the birth of an idea that will weave its way through centuries, eventually finding expression in the quiet offices of modern therapists, in the research labs of neuroscientists, and in the personal practices of anyone who has ever sought to find steadiness in an uncertain world. What you don't yet know, sitting there in the gentle evening air of ancient Rome, is that this seemingly simple insight about the power of perspective carries within it both extraordinary healing potential and subtle dangers that won't be fully understood for nearly 2,000 years. The techniques that grow from Epictetus's wisdom will one day help trauma survivors reclaim their lives and anxiety sufferers find peace. But they will also tempt others toward a kind of emotional invulnerability that might protect them from pain at the cost of cutting them off from joy, from love, from the very connections that make us most deeply human. As you drift deeper into contemplation, feeling the ancient stones still warm from the day's sun beneath you, you might find yourself wondering, what happens when the power to reframe reality becomes so refined, so absolute, that we lose touch with the raw, unfiltered experience of being human? Is it possible to become so skilled at managing our emotions that we forget how to simply feel them? These questions hover in the evening air like the scent of those Mediterranean herbs, subtle but persistent, inviting deeper exploration. This brings us to wonder about the journey from ancient wisdom to modern application, from the philosophical insights of a former slave to the systematic techniques developed by contemporary psychologists. There's something both fascinating and slightly unsettling about how ideas evolve, how practices intended for one purpose can be adapted for another, sometimes preserving their original spirit, and sometimes transforming into something their creators might not recognize. To truly understand how Epictetus's insight became both a foundation for healing and a potential pathway to emotional detachment, we need to step back into his world more fully, to understand not just what he taught, but why his particular life circumstances made him uniquely qualified to discover these truths about human resilience. Let's allow ourselves to drift back to that time when philosophy wasn't academic luxury but practical necessity, where the questions we're exploring tonight were literally matters of survival and freedom. This understanding opens a doorway to something deeper, a recognition that the wisdom we're exploring tonight didn't emerge from abstract theorizing, but from the lived reality of a man whose circumstances forced him to discover truths about human resilience that most of us never need to find. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves drawn back through the centuries, past the gaslit streets of Victorian London, past the printing presses of Renaissance Europe, past the monastery libraries of medieval times, until we arrive at a world where philosophy wasn't an academic discipline, but a practical art of survival. Picture yourself in the bustling heart of the Roman Empire during the late 1st century, when the marble buildings you glimpsed in that peaceful courtyard were still relatively new, their surfaces unmarked by the centuries of weathering that would eventually give them the patina we associate with ancient wisdom. The air in Rome carries different scents than you might expect, not just the olive oil and bread we noticed before, but also the sharper smell of metalwork from countless forges, the earthy aroma of animals being led to market, and underneath it all, the distinctly human smell of a city where over 1 million people live in closer quarters than most of us can imagine. But imagine now that you're not visiting as a curious observer. Instead, you find yourself in the position that Epictetus himself once occupied, that of a slave owned by Epaphroditus, a powerful freedman who serves in the court of Emperor Nero. Your days begin before dawn with the sound of bronze bells echoing across the Palatine Hill, calling the household to life, and you spend your hours attending to tasks that belong entirely to someone else's will. You feel the rough wool of a slave's tunic against your skin. Notice how your sandals have worn thin from countless errands through the city's stone streets. And perhaps most significantly, you experience what it means to have your fate entirely dependent on the moods and decisions of others. This is the world that shaped Epictetus before he became a teacher, and you might notice how profoundly different it is from our contemporary understanding of personal development or self-help. There are no books to read about improving your mindset, no therapists to consult about emotional regulation, no retreat centers where you can learn techniques for mental resilience. There is only the raw daily experience of powerlessness, and somehow within that constraint, the gradual recognition that even when you cannot control your external circumstances, something within you remains unconquerable. Perhaps you felt something similar in your own life, though likely in far gentler circumstances. That moment when you realize that while you cannot control what happens to you, you can control how you interpret what happens to you. Maybe it was during a period of illness when you discovered that your inner response to limitation was the one thing that remained entirely your own. Or during a time of professional uncertainty when you found that your peace of mind didn't actually depend on having all the answers. Epictetus learned this lesson in the most extreme classroom imaginable, where the stakes of mastering his inner life were nothing less than his sanity and his soul. As you settle deeper into this ancient world, you begin to understand that the techniques we explored in our first evening together, this ability to reframe perspective, to find freedom within constraint, weren't developed as optimization strategies for an already comfortable life. They emerged from necessity, from the recognition that when external freedom is impossible, internal freedom becomes not just desirable but essential. The famous injury to Epictetus's leg, whether it occurred through accident or deliberate cruelty during his slave years, served as a permanent physical reminder that some limitations simply cannot be changed, and that resilience lies not in denying these limitations, but in discovering how to live fully within them. This brings us to wonder about the nature of strength itself, doesn't it? In our time, we often equate strength with the ability to control outcomes, to bend circumstances to our will, to achieve what we want when we want it. But Epictetus discovered a different kind of strength, one that grows not from expanding control, but from clarifying what is and isn't within our control in the first place. Imagine the moment when this realization first dawned on him, perhaps while performing some menial task in his master's household, when he recognized that while his body could be commanded, his mind could remain entirely his own. The Stoic philosophy that grew from this insight wasn't a theoretical exercise, but a practical technology for psychological survival. When Epictetus eventually gained his freedom, we don't know exactly how, though it may have been through his master's recognition of his exceptional intelligence. He carried with him a tested understanding of how the human spirit can remain unbroken even under the most challenging circumstances. The school he established in Nicopolis, far from Rome, became a place where people came not to learn abstract wisdom, but to discover practical techniques for maintaining inner equilibrium regardless of external turbulence. You might find it soothing to imagine those students gathering in the evening light we visited earlier, bringing with them the struggles that are eternal to human experience, the fear of loss, the pain of rejection, the anxiety about an uncertain future, the grief of disappointed hopes. What Epictetus offered them wasn't the promise that these difficulties would disappear, but rather the far more valuable gift of learning how to remain centered within them. He taught them to distinguish between what the Stoics called impressions, the initial thoughts and feelings that arise automatically in response to events, and judgments, the interpretations and meanings we choose to assign to those impressions. This distinction might sound subtle, but its implications are revolutionary. Consider how it might feel to experience a setback at work and recognize that while the disappointment arises automatically, the impression, the story you tell yourself about what that setback means for your future, your worth, or your capabilities, the judgment, is something you can examine and, if necessary, revise. Epictetus would say that suffering comes not from the setback itself, but from the unexamined judgments we layer on top of it, the mental additions that transform a single difficult moment into a referendum on our entire life. As you drift deeper into this understanding, you might notice how this ancient insight parallels what modern psychologists call the difference between pain and suffering. Pain, whether physical or emotional, is often unavoidable. It's part of the basic human experience of living in a world that doesn't always align with our preferences. Suffering, however, is frequently optional. It's the additional layer of mental elaboration that we add to pain, the stories about what the pain means, the resistance to experiencing it, the demands that reality should be different than it is. There's something both liberating and slightly unsettling about this recognition, isn't there? Liberating because it suggests that much of what we experience as suffering is actually within our influence, that we have more power over our inner experience than we might have realized. Unsettling because it places responsibility squarely on our own shoulders, removing the comfort of believing that our emotional states are entirely determined by external circumstances. This tension between empowerment and responsibility leads us naturally toward the heart of what Epictetus discovered, and what modern psychology has refined into something both more systematic and perhaps more powerful than its ancient origins. Following this thread deeper into the mechanics of how our minds actually shape our reality, we find ourselves approaching what might be the most practical and transformative insight in all of human psychology: the recognition that we live not in the world as it is, but in the world as we interpret it. What if the key to unshakable strength lay not in changing the world around you, but in shifting the lens through which you see it? Picture yourself for a moment holding one of those old-fashioned kaleidoscopes. feeling the smooth brass surface warming under your fingers as you slowly rotate the cylinder. The colored glass fragments inside remain exactly the same, yet with each gentle turn, they create entirely different patterns, sometimes chaotic and jarring, sometimes surprisingly harmonious and beautiful. Your mind, it turns out, works in much the same way, though the fragments it arranges and rearranges are not pieces of colored glass but thoughts, interpretations, and meanings. This is the essence of what psychologists call cognitive reframing, though the clinical term doesn't quite capture the almost magical quality of the experience when you first discover it working in your own life. Perhaps you've noticed this yourself during those quiet moments when a situation that seemed overwhelming suddenly becomes manageable, not because anything external has changed, but because you've found a different way of understanding it. Maybe it was recognizing that what felt like a rejection was actually a redirection, or noticing that what seemed like a failure was really valuable information about what doesn't work. The process itself follows a deceptively simple pattern, like a gentle river that carves the deepest canyons through patient, persistent flow. It begins with what therapists call catching the automatic thought, that immediate, often negative interpretation that springs to mind when something challenging happens. Imagine sitting in a comfortable chair in a therapist's office, perhaps noticing the soft sound of a small fountain in the corner and the way afternoon light filters through gauzy curtains, as you learn to become aware of thoughts that usually pass by unnoticed, like learning to hear your own heartbeat for the first time. These automatic thoughts, you discover, often carry with them a whole catalog of what psychologists call cognitive distortions, predictable ways that minds tend to bend reality in unhelpful directions. There's the tendency to catastrophize, turning a single setback into evidence of inevitable disaster, or the habit of black and white thinking, where everything becomes either perfect or terrible with no middle ground. Perhaps you recognize the pattern of emotional reasoning, where the intensity of a feeling becomes proof of its validity, or the exhausting practice of mind reading, where we assume we know what others are thinking about us, usually something unflattering. What's fascinating is how universal these patterns are, as if human minds come equipped with a standard set of mental shortcuts that served us well in earlier times, but often create unnecessary suffering in the complexity of modern life. You might find it oddly comforting to learn that the worried thought that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning follows the same predictable patterns that have troubled minds for centuries, that your particular struggles with self-doubt or anxiety aren't unique personal failings, but rather common variations on ancient themes. The second part of the process involves what therapists call challenging these automatic thoughts, gently questioning their accuracy the way you might examine a suspect coin, turning it over in your mind to see if it's genuine or counterfeit. This isn't about forcing positivity or denying real problems, but rather about becoming curious about the stories we tell ourselves. Imagine yourself in that same peaceful therapy office, learning to ask questions like, is this thought helpful or just habitual? What evidence supports this interpretation? What evidence contradicts it? How might someone else view this situation? There's something almost detective-like about this process of investigation, isn't there? The way you learn to gather evidence, consider alternative explanations, and arrive at conclusions that are more balanced and often more accurate than your initial emotional reactions. You might notice how this gentle questioning creates a kind of mental space between yourself and your thoughts, a recognition that you are not your thoughts, but rather the one who observes them, considers them, and ultimately chooses which ones to believe. The final step involves crafting what therapists call a balanced thought, not a Pollyannish denial of difficulty, but a more complete and accurate understanding of the situation. This isn't about convincing yourself that everything is wonderful when it clearly isn't, but rather about developing what you might call emotional precision, the ability to respond to situations with the exact degree of concern they actually warrant, no more and no less. Imagine, for instance, receiving news that a project at work hasn't gone as planned. The automatic thought might be something catastrophic. I'm terrible at my job and everyone knows it now. The challenging process might involve questions like, is one setback really evidence of overall incompetence? Have I succeeded at other projects? How do my colleagues actually view my work? And the balanced thought might emerge as something like, this project didn't work out as hoped, which is disappointing, and I can learn from what went wrong and apply that learning to future work. You can almost feel the difference in your body as you consider these two ways of interpreting the same event, can't you? The way the catastrophic interpretation creates tension in your shoulders and a sinking feeling in your stomach, while the balanced interpretation allows you to breathe more easily, to think more clearly, to respond more effectively. This isn't just mental gymnastics, but a profound shift in how you relate to the inevitable challenges that life presents. As you settle deeper into this understanding, you might begin to appreciate how this process represents something more significant than just a therapeutic technique. It's really a systematic way of developing what ancient philosophers called wisdom, the ability to see situations clearly, without the distorting effects of fear, anger, or wishful thinking. Epictetus would recognize this practice immediately, though he might be amused by how elaborate we've made something he considered simply good sense. The beauty of cognitive reframing lies not just in its effectiveness, but in its accessibility. You don't need years of training or expensive equipment or perfect life circumstances to begin noticing your automatic thoughts and gently questioning their accuracy. Like learning to identify different bird calls or noticing the phases of the moon, it's a skill that develops naturally with gentle, consistent attention. Yet as you drift deeper into contemplation of this powerful technique, you might also begin to sense something that its ancient and modern practitioners sometimes overlook. A subtle question about what happens when this ability to reshape perspective becomes so refined, so systematic, that it begins to influence not just how we respond to life, but how we experience life itself. This naturally raises the question of whether there might be hidden costs to such powerful mental control, implications that deserve our careful consideration as we explore the deeper waters of psychological transformation. As you contemplate this possibility, you might notice how the very techniques that promise liberation can sometimes become their own subtle form of constraint, like water that can both nourish a garden and carve through solid rock, depending on how it flows and where it's directed. Like water that can both nourish a garden and carve through solid rock, the ability to reframe our thoughts holds profound, creative, and destructive potential, revealing itself to be far more than a simple self-help technique, but rather a fundamental shift in how we relate to our own minds. Picture yourself standing beside a mountain stream, feeling the cool mist on your face as you watch water flowing over ancient stones, sometimes pooling in quiet eddies where fish swim lazily in dappled sunlight, sometimes rushing with surprising force through narrow channels it has carved over centuries of patient persistence. This is perhaps the perfect metaphor for understanding how cognitive reframing works in the landscape of human healing, gentle enough to create spaces of peace and clarity, yet powerful enough to reshape the most stubborn patterns of thought. In the quiet consultation rooms where therapists work with people who have experienced trauma, you can witness this dual nature of cognitive restructuring most clearly. Imagine yourself in such a space, perhaps a room with soft, indirect lighting that seems to wrap around the furniture like a gentle embrace, where the air carries the faint scent of lavender, and the only sounds are the barely audible hum of a small fountain and the occasional rustle of papers as someone writes in a journal. Here, the systematic questioning of automatic thoughts becomes not just an intellectual exercise, but a pathway back to emotional freedom. You might recognize this healing process from your own life, those moments when a therapist or wise friend helped you see that the story you were telling yourself about a painful experience wasn't the only possible story. Perhaps it was recognizing that a betrayal by someone you trusted, while genuinely painful, didn't actually prove that all relationships are dangerous, or discovering that a professional setback, while disappointing, wasn't evidence of fundamental inadequacy, but rather valuable information about which paths might serve you better. The relief that comes from this realization isn't just emotional but physical. You can actually feel your breathing deepen, your shoulders relax, your jaw unclench as the grip of the old interpretation loosens. The research on cognitive restructuring reveals something remarkable about human resilience. When people learn to identify and challenge their automatic negative thoughts systematically, they don't just feel better temporarily. They actually develop a kind of psychological immunity to future distress. It's as if the mind learns to recognize the early warning signs of unhelpful thinking, patterns the way the body learns to recognize and neutralize familiar threats. One study with therapists found that those who practiced cognitive reframing techniques while listening to trauma narratives experienced significantly less secondary trauma. They could remain compassionate and present with their clients' pain without absorbing that pain as their own. This protective quality of cognitive reframing becomes even more apparent when we consider its applications for anxiety, that peculiar form of suffering that seems to feed on itself. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself, the way a single worried thought can multiply into an entire catastrophic scenario, each new concern building on the last until you find yourself lying awake at 3 a.m, convinced that a minor workplace disagreement has revealed your complete professional incompetence and will inevitably lead to unemployment, financial ruin, and social isolation. The beauty of cognitive restructuring in these moments lies in its ability to interrupt this cascade before it reaches its most devastating conclusions. Imagine learning to catch that first worried thought, "My boss seemed irritated during our meeting," and gently examining it with curious rather than fearful attention. What evidence supports this interpretation? What evidence contradicts it? Might there be other explanations for your boss's demeanor that have nothing to do with your performance? As you practice this gentle investigation, you begin to notice how much of anxiety is actually built on assumptions rather than facts, on possibilities rather than probabilities, on fears rather than evidence. The implications extend far beyond individual therapy sessions into the broader landscape of human resilience. In research with individuals who have experienced severe trauma, including those with post-traumatic stress disorder, cognitive restructuring has proven to be one of the most effective interventions available. But this effectiveness reveals something profound about the nature of healing itself. That recovery often comes not from forgetting painful experiences or numbing our emotional responses to them, but from learning to hold those experiences within a larger, more complete understanding of ourselves and our capabilities. You might find it both comforting and slightly mysterious that the same technique that helps someone overcome the aftermath of a car accident can also help a graduate student manage test anxiety, or that the principles that guide trauma recovery can be applied to the everyday frustrations of interpersonal conflict. This suggests that beneath the surface differences in our individual struggles lies something universal about how human minds create suffering and how they can learn to create peace instead. As you settle deeper into this understanding, you might begin to appreciate how cognitive reframing represents a democratization of wisdom. It takes insights that were once available only to those with access to years of therapy or decades of philosophical study, and makes them accessible to anyone willing to pay gentle attention to their own thinking patterns. There's something profoundly hopeful about this accessibility. The recognition that the tools for emotional freedom don't require special talents or perfect life circumstances, but can be developed by anyone with the patience to notice their thoughts and the courage to question them. Yet as you drift deeper into contemplation of this remarkable technique, you might also begin to sense something that deserves our careful attention. A subtle recognition that any tool powerful enough to reshape our relationship with reality carries within it the potential for unintended consequences. Just as a skilled gardener knows that the same pruning shears that encourage healthy growth can also damage a plant if used carelessly, we must consider what happens when the ability to reframe perspective becomes so refined that it begins to alter not just our response to difficult experiences, but our capacity to fully engage with the raw, unfiltered complexity of human emotion itself. This awareness brings us naturally to explore what ancient practitioners discovered about the delicate balance between acceptance and change, between engaging with life as it is and working to reshape our experience of it. As this understanding settles into deeper layers of consideration, we find ourselves approaching practices that push the boundaries of what most people would consider normal emotional regulation. Techniques that promise not just healing from trauma, but transformation into something approaching invulnerability. Following this thread deeper into territories that feel both ancient and surprisingly modern, we encounter a practice so counterintuitive that it initially seems almost cruel, yet which reveals itself to be one of the most profound methods for building unshakable peace of mind. In the quiet hours before dawn, ancient Stoics would practice something that might seem unsettling to modern minds, deliberately imagining the loss of everything they held dear, a technique they called premeditatio malorum, or the rehearsal of ruin. Picture yourself in one of those serene Roman gardens we visited earlier, but now in the soft, gray light of early morning when the world feels hushed and contemplative, the air cool against your skin, and carrying the faint scent of dew-dampened earth and the nearby Mediterranean herbs that grow wild among the carefully placed stones. In this peaceful setting, a practitioner would systematically envision the death of loved ones, the loss of possessions, the destruction of everything that normally provides comfort and security. This might sound like a recipe for anxiety rather than peace, doesn't it? Yet there's something profoundly liberating that emerges from this deliberate confrontation with impermanence, something that modern psychology has begun to understand through research into what we now call cognitive rehearsal and exposure therapy. Perhaps you've noticed this phenomenon in your own life, the way that imagining a feared outcome often removes much of its power over you, or how the anticipation of a difficult conversation is frequently worse than the conversation itself. The psychological mechanisms at work in this ancient practice are surprisingly sophisticated. When we systematically imagine loss, we're essentially training our minds to become familiar with the territory of grief and disappointment before we're forced to navigate it in reality. It's like learning to swim in calm, controlled conditions so that you're prepared should you ever find yourself unexpectedly in turbulent waters. You might recognize this same principle in the way parents gradually expose children to small challenges and disappointments, helping them develop the emotional muscle memory needed for larger difficulties later in life. But the rehearsal of ruin serves another function that's perhaps even more valuable. It acts as a powerful antidote to what psychologists call hedonic adaptation, that peculiar human tendency to take good things for granted once they become familiar. Imagine sitting in that dawn garden, deliberately picturing the loss of your home, and then opening your eyes to see that home still standing, still sheltering you. The relief and gratitude that flood through you aren't manufactured or artificial, but represent a genuine recalibration of perspective, a reminder of how fortunate you are to have what you normally consider merely ordinary. Modern practitioners have adapted this ancient technique into more systematic approaches. Tim Ferriss's fear-setting exercise, for instance, guides people through a written analysis of their worst-case scenarios, asking them to define exactly what they're afraid might happen, identify ways to prevent or minimize those outcomes, and consider strategies for recovery if the feared events actually occur. There's something deeply calming about this methodical approach to anxiety, the way it transforms vague, formless dread into specific, manageable challenges. You might find it curious how this practice of imagining loss actually enhances our capacity for joy and connection, rather than diminishing it. When you regularly contemplate the temporary nature of everything you value, not in a morbid way, but with the gentle acknowledgement that impermanence is simply the nature of existence, you begin to hold your blessings more lightly and appreciate them more fully. It's like the difference between clutching something tightly in your fist, where you can barely feel it and live in constant fear of losing it, and holding it gently in your open palm, where you can truly appreciate its texture, weight, and beauty while accepting that it may not always be there. Perhaps you've experienced something similar during a loved one's illness, when the possibility of loss made every conversation more precious, every shared meal more meaningful, every ordinary moment somehow luminous with significance. The rehearsal of ruin systematically cultivates this same heightened appreciation, but without requiring actual crisis to trigger it. In other words, it teaches us to see with the clarity that usually comes only through loss, while we still have time to fully savor what we're seeing. As you settle deeper into contemplation of this practice, you might notice how it reveals something profound about the relationship between acceptance and attachment. The ancient Stoics understood that we can love deeply without clinging desperately, that we can care intensely about outcomes while remaining centered regardless of which outcomes actually unfold. This isn't emotional detachment in the sense of not caring, but rather a more sophisticated form of engagement that remains stable even when circumstances change. Interestingly, this same principle appears in various forms across different wisdom traditions. Buddhist meditation practices often include contemplations on impermanence, encouraging practitioners to reflect on the transient nature of all phenomena. Modern psychology has developed similar techniques for treating anxiety disorders, gradually exposing people to feared situations or thoughts until those fears lose their power to overwhelm. The underlying insight remains remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. By befriending uncertainty rather than fighting it, we discover a kind of peace that doesn't depend on controlling outcomes. Yet as you drift deeper into this understanding, you might begin to sense something that deserves our gentle attention. While the rehearsal of ruin can indeed build remarkable resilience and genuine gratitude, there's a subtle line between healthy acceptance of impermanence and a kind of emotional preemptive strike that might protect us from loss by diminishing our capacity for full engagement. The question emerges like morning mist. Can this practice of imagining endings sometimes become a way of avoiding the vulnerability required for truly intimate beginnings? This awareness brings us naturally toward recognizing how these powerful practices of emotional regulation, from cognitive reframing to rehearsing loss, exist within a larger landscape of techniques that promise psychological mastery. Perhaps by exploring how these ancient insights weave together in the fabric of daily human experience, we can better understand both their profound gifts and their subtle limitations, approaching that delicate balance between strength and openness that seems to lie at the heart of what it means to be both resilient and fully human. This awareness brings us naturally toward recognizing how these powerful practices of emotional regulation, from cognitive reframing to rehearsing loss, exist within a larger landscape of techniques that promise psychological mastery, each one touching something deep and recognizable in our own lived experience. Perhaps you've noticed how the mind's attempts to protect us can sometimes become the very barriers that limit us, like a castle built so strong that it keeps out not only enemies, but also friends, sunlight, and the very life we sought to preserve. Picture yourself standing at the window of such a fortress, looking out through thick stone walls at a world that seems both beautiful and threatening, feeling the cool dampness of ancient stone against your palms as you realize that the same structure that offers safety also creates a kind of isolation you never intended. We all share this fundamental tension between the desire for security and the yearning for connection, between the impulse to shield ourselves from pain and the recognition that such shields often block joy as well. In your quieter moments, you may have wondered about the people in your life who seem to possess an almost supernatural calm in the face of difficulty. Those individuals who navigate crisis with such apparent ease that you find yourself both admiring and slightly distrusting their composure. Perhaps it's a colleague who never seems rattled by workplace drama, maintaining the same level professional demeanor whether receiving praise or criticism, or a friend who discusses major life challenges with the same emotional tone they might use to describe the weather. There's something both inspiring and vaguely unsettling about such equanimity, isn't there? What you might be sensing in these moments of observation is the presence of highly refined emotional regulation skills, techniques that allow certain individuals to maintain psychological stability regardless of external circumstances. These are often people who have discovered, whether through formal training or life experience, how to apply the principles we've been exploring: cognitive reframing, acceptance of impermanence, the systematic questioning of automatic thoughts. They've learned to create what psychologists call emotional flexibility, the ability to experience feelings without being overwhelmed by them, to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it. You might recognize this capacity in yourself during certain moments. Perhaps when comforting a friend through a difficult time, you've noticed how your own emotional state remained stable and compassionate even while witnessing their distress. Or maybe during a particularly challenging period in your own life, you discovered resources of calm and clarity that surprised you, as if you were accessing some deeper layer of yourself that existed beneath the surface turbulence of immediate circumstances. These experiences offer glimpses of what becomes possible when emotional regulation skills are highly developed. Yet as you consider these examples, you might also notice something that deserves gentle attention. Sometimes the very techniques that create emotional stability can subtly alter our relationship with the full spectrum of human feeling. Imagine sitting across from that unflappably calm colleague during a moment when you're sharing something deeply personal and meaningful to you, and noticing how their steady composure, while admirable, somehow makes you feel as though your emotional response is excessive or inappropriate. In other words, their emotional regulation, while clearly beneficial for them, might inadvertently create distance in the very relationships it's meant to preserve. This points to something profound about the nature of emotional techniques themselves. While practices like cognitive reframing and acceptance of impermanence can indeed create remarkable resilience, they can also, when taken to extremes, begin to function like a thermostat that keeps the emotional temperature always at the same comfortable setting. You might find yourself wondering, what happens to the natural ebb and flow of feeling that seems so essential to being fully alive? What about those moments when appropriate anger motivates necessary change, or when deep grief honors the significance of what's been lost? Perhaps you've experienced this yourself, times when you've successfully reframed a situation that actually deserved your full emotional response, moments when your ability to find silver linings prevented you from acknowledging legitimate problems that required action rather than acceptance. Or maybe you've noticed how the practice of emotional regulation can sometimes become a subtle form of self-judgment, where any strong feeling is seen as evidence of insufficient wisdom or spiritual development. The very skills that promise freedom can gradually become another way to critique and control our natural responses to life. There's something both fascinating and concerning about how these techniques can evolve from tools of healing into tools of control. Consider the workplace, where emotional intelligence becomes code for never expressing frustration with genuinely problematic policies, or the relationship where one partner's commitment to staying centered effectively silences the other's legitimate concerns. In other words, emotional regulation skills, like any powerful tools, can be used to build bridges or to build walls, to create deeper understanding or to maintain comfortable distance. As you drift deeper into this recognition, you might begin to appreciate why the ancient practitioners embedded these techniques within larger philosophical frameworks that emphasized virtue, wisdom, and service to the common good. They understood something that modern applications sometimes overlook, that the goal of emotional regulation isn't to achieve perfect control over our inner lives, but rather to develop the clarity and stability needed to respond to life's challenges with wisdom and compassion. The strength they sought wasn't the brittle invulnerability of the fortress, but the flexible resilience of the tree that bends without breaking. You might notice how this understanding creates a subtle shift in how you view your own emotional landscape. Rather than seeing feelings as problems to be solved or states to be managed, you begin to recognize them as information, sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted, but always worthy of gentle attention rather than immediate control. This doesn't mean becoming overwhelmed by every passing emotion, but rather developing what you might call emotional discernment, the ability to distinguish between feelings that deserve action and those that deserve simple acknowledgement and release. Perhaps the most profound insight emerging from this exploration is that true emotional mastery lies not in achieving perfect control, but in developing a more sophisticated relationship with the entire spectrum of human feeling. This awareness brings us naturally toward considering how these individual practices of emotional regulation exist within a much larger web of human interaction, where the way we manage our own emotions inevitably affects, and is affected by, the emotional lives of everyone around us. As this understanding settles into deeper contemplation, we find ourselves approaching questions about how personal psychological techniques interact with the social and cultural contexts that shape us all. Recognizing that no individual practice of emotional regulation exists in isolation, but rather unfolds within a vast landscape of human wisdom and inquiry. Picture these ideas as landmarks in a vast intellectual landscape, each peak of understanding offering new views of the eternal questions that shape human experience, where the path we've been following, from ancient Stoicism through modern cognitive therapy, reveals itself to be just one of many trails that wind through this timeless territory of the human search for resilience and meaning. Picture yourself standing on a high mountain plateau at twilight, feeling the cool evening air against your skin as you gaze out over rolling hills that stretch beyond the horizon, each rise and valley representing different approaches to the fundamental questions of how we might live with wisdom, courage, and compassion. From this elevated perspective, you can see how the Stoic practices we've been exploring, cognitive reframing, acceptance of impermanence, rehearsal of loss, occupy their own distinct region in this landscape, characterized by clear paths and well-defined landmarks, but connected by gentle ridges and shared watersheds to other territories of human understanding. Perhaps you can make out, in the soft light of early evening, the contemplative valleys where Buddhist practitioners have developed their own sophisticated approaches to emotional regulation, techniques that share remarkable similarities with Stoic methods while maintaining their own unique flavor and emphasis. There, in meditation halls that smell of incense and echo with the soft sound of breathing, practitioners learn to observe thoughts and feelings with what they call equanimity, a quality of mind that neither grasps after pleasant experiences nor pushes away unpleasant ones, but rests in awareness itself. As your gaze moves across this imagined landscape, you might notice how these Eastern approaches to mental training often emphasize direct experience over intellectual analysis, inviting practitioners to discover through sustained attention what the Stoics learned through systematic reasoning. Both traditions recognize that suffering often comes not from circumstances themselves, but from our resistance to circumstances, yet they offer different pathways to the same essential insight. Where Epictetus taught his students to question their automatic thoughts, Buddhist meditation guides practitioners to simply observe those thoughts without attachment or judgment, allowing them to arise and pass away like clouds in an empty sky. Interestingly, you might observe how these ancient wisdom traditions connect through underground streams to the springs that nourish modern psychological approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which we explored earlier, draws explicitly from Stoic philosophy, while newer approaches like dialectical behavior therapy incorporate mindfulness techniques that trace back directly to Buddhist meditation practices. The landscape reveals itself to be not a collection of isolated peaks, but an interconnected ecosystem where insights flow naturally from one tradition to another across centuries and cultures. From your elevated viewpoint, you can also see how self-determination theory occupies its own distinctive region of this intellectual terrain, one that might initially seem to conflict with the more acceptance-oriented approaches we've been exploring. This psychological framework emphasizes three fundamental human needs: autonomy, relatedness, and competence, and suggests that well-being emerges not from controlling our responses to life, but from creating conditions that allow these intrinsic motivations to flourish. In other words, where Stoicism teaches us to accept what we cannot change, self-determination theory encourages us to actively shape our environment to support our deepest needs for growth and connection. You might find it curious how these seemingly different approaches can coexist peacefully in the broader landscape of human wisdom, like complementary seasons in the same climate. Perhaps the key lies in recognizing that different techniques serve different purposes and different moments in the human journey. There are times when Stoic acceptance provides exactly the foundation needed to navigate unavoidable difficulties, and other times when the active pursuit of autonomy and connection offers the most healing path forward. Wisdom lies not in choosing one approach over another, but in developing the discernment to recognize which tool serves each particular situation. As twilight deepens in your imagined vista, you might notice how the landscape also includes territories that explore what happens when these various approaches to emotional regulation are taken to their logical extremes. Here we encounter research into the psychology of power, which reveals how the very mastery that these techniques promise can sometimes lead to unexpected consequences. Studies show that people who gain significant control over their environment, whether through wealth, authority, or psychological skill, often experience a gradual erosion of empathy and social awareness. The ability to regulate one's own emotions, while clearly beneficial, can sometimes create a subtle distance from the emotional experiences of others. This recognition creates a gentle tension in the landscape, doesn't it? We see how the techniques that promise to make us stronger and more resilient can also, paradoxically, make us less connected to the very relationships that give life its deepest meaning. Perhaps you've sensed this yourself in moments when your own emotional equilibrium felt somehow separate from the concerns and struggles of people around you, or when your ability to stay centered inadvertently communicated a lack of engagement with others' legitimate emotions. As you settle deeper into this contemplation, you might begin to appreciate how this vast landscape of approaches to human resilience points toward something profound about the nature of wisdom itself. True understanding seems to emerge not from mastering any single technique or philosophy, but from developing what you might call philosophical flexibility, the ability to draw from different traditions and approaches as circumstances require, always in service of the larger goals of wisdom, compassion, and genuine human flourishing. The mountain air grows cooler as night approaches, and you feel yourself naturally beginning to turn your attention from this broad, panoramic view toward more specific questions about how these various streams of wisdom might flow together in practical ways. The landscape we've surveyed reveals itself to be not a map to be memorized, but a living ecosystem to be explored, where ancient insights continue to inform modern discoveries, and where the question of how to live well remains as compelling and complex as ever. From this elevated perspective, you can sense that our journey is preparing to descend into more intimate territories, where these broad philosophical principles begin to weave themselves into the specific fabric of individual human lives, creating patterns both beautiful and sometimes surprisingly complex. Like a master weaver creating a tapestry, we now begin to see how the threads of ancient wisdom and modern understanding create a complex pattern of light and shadow, where techniques that promise extraordinary strength reveal themselves to carry unexpected costs, and where the pursuit of invulnerability might paradoxically lead to a different kind of vulnerability altogether. Picture yourself in a quiet weaving room filled with golden afternoon light, feeling the smooth wooden shuttle warm in your hands as you work threads of different colors and textures into an emerging pattern that tells a story you're only beginning to understand. The threads before you represent everything we've explored together: the silver strand of Epictetus's cognitive reframing, the deep blue of ancient rehearsal practices, the rich burgundy of modern therapeutic techniques, and running through them all, a golden thread that represents something harder to name but equally important: the question of what happens to our humanity when we become too skilled at controlling our own emotional responses. As you work the shuttle back and forth, you begin to notice how these different approaches to emotional regulation, while each valuable in isolation, create unexpected patterns when woven together. Perhaps you've experienced something similar in your own life, moments when the very techniques that served you well in one situation seem to create distance or difficulty in another. Maybe it was discovering that your ability to stay positive during a crisis, while personally helpful, somehow made others feel that their own emotional responses were inappropriate or excessive. Or perhaps you've noticed how mastering your own emotional reactions can sometimes leave you feeling slightly disconnected from the raw, unfiltered experiences that once provided life with its most vivid colors. The research on power and empathy reveals one of the most striking patterns in this emerging tapestry. Studies consistently show that as people gain greater control over their environment, whether through wealth, authority, or psychological mastery, they often experience a gradual erosion of their ability to understand and connect with others' emotional experiences. It's as if the very strength that protects them from being overwhelmed by external circumstances also creates a subtle barrier to the vulnerability required for deep intimacy and genuine empathy. You might find it both fascinating and troubling to consider how this applies to the psychological techniques we've been exploring. The person who becomes highly skilled at cognitive reframing, for instance, might find themselves automatically analyzing and restructuring other people's emotional expressions rather than simply being present with them. The practitioner of premeditatio malorum might develop such equanimity in the face of loss that they struggle to fully celebrate gain. In other words, the very tools that promise freedom can sometimes become sophisticated forms of imprisonment, separating us from the full spectrum of human experience even as they protect us from its most difficult aspects. There's something almost tragic about this recognition, isn't there? The techniques that emerge from the deepest human wisdom about resilience and healing can, when pursued as ends in themselves rather than means to greater connection and service, lead to a kind of emotional isolation that their creators never intended. Epictetus, who developed his insights in the crucible of slavery and powerlessness, might be surprised to see how his teachings could be used to create a different kind of separation, not the forced isolation of external constraint, but the chosen detachment of internal control. As you continue working at your imagined loom, feeling the satisfying rhythm of the shuttle moving through the warp threads, you begin to discern another pattern emerging in the tapestry, one that suggests a different possibility altogether. This pattern shows how the same techniques that can lead to emotional isolation might also, when approached with wisdom and humility, serve as foundations for an even deeper form of connection and engagement with life. The key seems to lie not in the techniques themselves, but in the spirit with which they're practiced and the purposes they're meant to serve. Consider how differently these practices feel when they're understood not as methods for achieving personal invulnerability, but as skills that enable greater service to others. The person who has learned to regulate their own emotional responses through cognitive reframing might use that stability not to distance themselves from others' pain, but to remain present and helpful in situations where someone less emotionally regulated might become overwhelmed. The practitioner of acceptance and impermanence might find that their peace with uncertainty allows them to support others through difficult transitions without adding their own anxiety to an already challenging situation. Perhaps you've witnessed this distinction yourself, the difference between emotional regulation that serves the ego and emotional regulation that serves love. Maybe you've encountered someone whose obvious psychological sophistication somehow made you feel more seen and understood rather than less, or noticed in yourself moments when your own emotional stability allowed you to be genuinely helpful to someone in crisis rather than simply protected from their distress. This recognition brings us to what might be the most important insight in our entire exploration, that the value of any psychological technique lies not in its power to make us stronger or more controlled, but in its ability to make us more available for the connections and service that give life its deepest meaning. Put differently, true emotional mastery reveals itself not in the capacity to remain unmoved by life's difficulties, but in the ability to be moved appropriately, to respond with exactly the degree of emotion that serves the situation and the people involved. As the golden light in your imagined weaving room begins to soften into the gentler tones of early evening, you might find yourself appreciating how this understanding transforms everything we've explored together. The techniques remain valuable, but they're no longer ultimate goals in themselves. Instead, they become tools in service of something larger, the ancient human aspiration to live with wisdom, courage, and compassion, to be both strong enough to weather life's storms and tender enough to remain open to its gifts. There's something deeply satisfying about this recognition, like watching scattered puzzle pieces suddenly reveal the image they were always meant to create. The apparent contradiction between strength and vulnerability dissolves when we understand that true strength includes the capacity for appropriate vulnerability, and that genuine emotional mastery manifests not as imperviousness, but as responsiveness, the ability to feel exactly what serves the moment without being overwhelmed by what doesn't. This synthesis naturally prepares us to explore how these insights might translate into the practical reality of contemporary life, where ancient wisdom meets modern challenges, and where the question becomes not whether to develop emotional regulation skills, but how to develop them in ways that serve our deepest values and our most important relationships. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching the shores of present-day application, where the timeless principles we've explored reveal their continuing relevance in the lived experience of modern humans seeking both strength and connection. In your own life, you might have noticed the difference between the brittle strength that breaks under pressure and the flexible strength that bends without breaking, like the difference between a rigid oak branch that snaps in a storm and the supple willow that dances with the wind and emerges unharmed. Picture yourself walking through a peaceful office building on a quiet morning, perhaps noticing the soft hum of climate control systems and the gentle tap of footsteps on polished floors. As you observe leaders who embody this more sophisticated kind of resilience, individuals who have learned to remain centered without becoming distant, strong without becoming inflexible. Perhaps you've encountered someone like Satya Nadella, whose transformation of Microsoft's culture illustrates how emotional intelligence can serve as the foundation for both personal effectiveness and organizational compassion. When he became CEO, Nadella brought to the role a quality of presence that seemed to make space for others' ideas and concerns rather than demanding that they conform to his own vision. You might recognize this quality from your own experience, that feeling of being truly heard and seen by someone whose own emotional stability doesn't require them to control or minimize your emotional expressions. There's something deeply calming about being in the presence of such individuals, isn't there? Their emotional regulation doesn't create walls, but rather provides a kind of spaciousness that allows authentic communication to flourish. Nadella's emphasis on empathy as a core business skill transformed not just Microsoft's internal culture, but also its relationship with customers and competitors, demonstrating how personal emotional mastery can serve collective flourishing rather than individual dominance. His leadership style suggests a way of being powerful that enhances rather than diminishes others' sense of agency and worth. Interestingly, this kind of emotionally intelligent leadership often emerges from techniques remarkably similar to those we've been exploring throughout our journey together. The practices of mindful awareness, cognitive flexibility, and acceptance of uncertainty that characterize effective modern leaders trace their lineage directly back to ancient wisdom traditions. Yet these contemporary applications reveal something crucial about how such techniques can be employed in service of connection rather than separation, collaboration rather than control. You might find yourself wondering what distinguishes this application of emotional regulation from the more problematic versions we've discussed. Perhaps the key lies in what psychologists call other-focused versus self-focused motivation, the difference between developing emotional stability in order to serve others more effectively and developing it primarily to protect oneself from discomfort or vulnerability. When emotional regulation serves love and service, it tends to enhance empathy and connection. When it serves primarily ego protection, it often creates the subtle barriers we've explored. Breathe in the recognition that this distinction offers a kind of compass for navigating your own development of emotional regulation skills. As you consider the various techniques we've explored, cognitive reframing, acceptance of impermanence, systematic emotional analysis, you might ask yourself, how can I practice these skills in ways that make me more available to others rather than more insulated from them? This question transforms the entire enterprise from self-improvement to relationship enhancement, from personal optimization to service preparation. Perhaps you've noticed in your own relationships how your emotional state affects not just your own experience but the emotional climate of everyone around you. When you're anxious, others often become more tense. When you're peaceful, that peace tends to spread. This recognition suggests that developing emotional regulation isn't just a personal choice, but a kind of gift we offer to our communities, a way of contributing to the collective emotional well-being of the spaces we inhabit. Consider how this perspective might transform your approach to difficult emotions themselves. Instead of seeing anger, sadness, or fear as problems to be eliminated, you might begin to appreciate them as information about what matters to you and what might need attention in your environment. Emotional regulation, from this perspective, becomes less about suppression and more about what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtle variations in feeling and respond appropriately to each. This more sophisticated relationship with emotion finds expression in approaches like dialectical behavior therapy, which teaches skills for experiencing intense emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Picture yourself in a peaceful therapy office, perhaps noticing the soft lighting and the gentle sound of a small fountain, as you learn techniques for riding the wave of difficult emotions rather than fighting against them or being swept away by them. These skills, distress tolerance, mindfulness, emotional regulation, echo the ancient wisdom we've explored while offering practical tools for modern life. You might recognize these principles at work in your own moments of greatest clarity and effectiveness, times when you've been able to remain calm during family conflicts, not because you didn't care about the outcome, but because your stability allowed you to respond more skillfully to what the situation actually required. Or perhaps you've experienced how accepting the reality of a disappointment, rather than fighting against it or rushing to positive thinking, created space for genuine problem-solving and creative response. There's something almost paradoxical about how fully feeling our emotions often allows us to be less controlled by them, isn't there? When we create space for our feelings to exist without immediately trying to change or eliminate them, they often naturally shift toward greater balance. This process requires what you might call emotional courage, the willingness to experience the full spectrum of human feeling without being overwhelmed by it or using emotional regulation as a form of avoidance. As you settle deeper into this understanding, you might begin to appreciate how these contemporary applications of ancient wisdom point toward a kind of emotional maturity that our culture desperately needs. In a world where technology often amplifies our emotional reactivity and social media can turn minor irritations into major conflicts, the skills of emotional regulation become not just personal assets but social necessities. Yet they must be practiced with wisdom and compassion, always in service of greater connection and understanding rather than personal invulnerability. This recognition brings us naturally toward contemplating the deeper questions that arise when we fully integrate these insights into our lives. Questions about what kind of person we want to become, what kind of world we want to help create, and how the ancient human aspiration toward wisdom, courage, and compassion might find expression in our own unique circumstances and relationships. As the gentle awareness of possibility settles into deeper contemplation, we find ourselves approaching the threshold of a more complete understanding, one that honors both the power of these techniques and the humanity they're meant to serve. This synthesis naturally prepares us to explore how these insights might translate into the practical reality of contemporary life, where ancient wisdom meets modern challenges, and where the question becomes not whether to develop emotional regulation skills, but how to develop them in ways that serve our deepest values and our most important relationships. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, we find ourselves approaching the shores of present-day application, where the timeless principles we've explored reveal their continuing relevance in the lived experience of modern humans seeking both strength and connection. In your own life, you might have noticed the difference between the brittle strength that breaks under pressure and the flexible strength that bends without breaking, like the difference between a rigid oak branch that snaps in a storm and the supple willow that dances with the wind and emerges unharmed. Picture yourself walking through a peaceful office building on a quiet morning, perhaps noticing the soft hum of climate control systems and the gentle tap of footsteps on polished floors. As you observe leaders who embody this more sophisticated kind of resilience, individuals who have learned to remain centered without becoming distant, strong without becoming inflexible. Perhaps you've encountered someone like Satya Nadella, whose transformation of Microsoft's culture illustrates how emotional intelligence can serve as the foundation for both personal effectiveness and organizational compassion. When he became CEO, Nadella brought to the role a quality of presence that seemed to make space for others' ideas and concerns rather than demanding that they conform to his own vision. You might recognize this quality from your own experience, that feeling of being truly heard and seen by someone whose own emotional stability doesn't require them to control or minimize your emotional expressions. There's something deeply calming about being in the presence of such individuals, isn't there? Their emotional regulation doesn't create walls, but rather provides a kind of spaciousness that allows authentic communication to flourish. Nadella's emphasis on empathy as a core business skill transformed not just Microsoft's internal culture, but also its relationship with customers and competitors, demonstrating how personal emotional mastery can serve collective flourishing rather than individual dominance. His leadership style suggests a way of being powerful that enhances rather than diminishes others' sense of agency and worth. Interestingly, this kind of emotionally intelligent leadership often emerges from techniques remarkably similar to those we've been exploring throughout our journey together. The practices of mindful awareness, cognitive flexibility, and acceptance of uncertainty that characterize effective modern leaders trace their lineage directly back to ancient wisdom traditions. Yet these contemporary applications reveal something crucial about how such techniques can be employed in service of connection rather than separation, collaboration rather than control. You might find yourself wondering what distinguishes this application of emotional regulation from the more problematic versions we've discussed. Perhaps the key lies in what psychologists call other-focused versus self-focused motivation, the difference between developing emotional stability in order to serve others more effectively and developing it primarily to protect oneself from discomfort or vulnerability. When emotional regulation serves love and service, it tends to enhance empathy and connection. When it serves primarily ego protection, it often creates the subtle barriers we've explored. Breathe in the recognition that this distinction offers a kind of compass for navigating your own development of emotional regulation skills. As you consider the various techniques we've explored, cognitive reframing, acceptance of impermanence, systematic emotional analysis, you might ask yourself, how can I practice these skills in ways that make me more available to others rather than more insulated from them? This question transforms the entire enterprise from self-improvement to relationship enhancement, from personal optimization to service preparation. Perhaps you've noticed in your own relationships how your emotional state affects not just your own experience but the emotional climate of everyone around you. When you're anxious, others often become more tense. When you're peaceful, that peace tends to spread. This recognition suggests that developing emotional regulation isn't just a personal choice, but a kind of gift we offer to our communities, a way of contributing to the collective emotional well-being of the spaces we inhabit. Consider how this perspective might transform your approach to difficult emotions themselves. Instead of seeing anger, sadness, or fear as problems to be eliminated, you might begin to appreciate them as information about what matters to you and what might need attention in your environment. Emotional regulation, from this perspective, becomes less about suppression and more about what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtle variations in feeling and respond appropriately to each. This more sophisticated relationship with emotion finds expression in approaches like dialectical behavior therapy, which teaches skills for experiencing intense emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Picture yourself in a peaceful therapy office, perhaps noticing the soft lighting and the gentle sound of a small fountain, as you learn techniques for riding the wave of difficult emotions rather than fighting against them or being swept away by them. These skills, distress tolerance, mindfulness, emotional regulation, echo the ancient wisdom we've explored while offering practical tools for modern life. You might recognize these principles at work in your own moments of greatest clarity and effectiveness. Times when you've been able to remain calm during family conflicts, not because you didn't care about the outcome, but because your stability allowed you to respond more skillfully to what the situation actually required. Or perhaps you've experienced how accepting the reality of a disappointment, rather than fighting against it or rushing to positive thinking, created space for genuine problem-solving and creative response. There's something almost paradoxical about how fully feeling our emotions often allows us to be less controlled by them, isn't there? When we create space for our feelings to exist without immediately trying to change or eliminate them, they often naturally shift toward greater balance. This process requires what you might call emotional courage, the willingness to experience the full spectrum of human feeling without being overwhelmed by it or using emotional regulation as a form of avoidance. As you settle deeper into this understanding, you might begin to appreciate how these contemporary applications of ancient wisdom point toward a kind of emotional maturity that our culture desperately needs. In a world where technology often amplifies our emotional reactivity and social media can turn minor irritations into major conflicts, the skills of emotional regulation become not just personal assets, but social necessities. Yet they must be practiced with wisdom and compassion, always in service of greater connection and understanding rather than personal invulnerability. This recognition brings us naturally toward contemplating the deeper questions that arise when we fully integrate these insights into our lives. Questions about what kind of person we want to become, what kind of world we want to help create, and how the ancient human aspiration toward wisdom, courage, and compassion might find expression in our own unique circumstances and relationships. As the gentle awareness of possibility settles into deeper contemplation, we find ourselves approaching the threshold of a more complete understanding, one that honors both the power of these techniques and the humanity they're meant to serve. And so these thoughts settle like evening mist, no longer separate from the quiet spaces of your mind, where Epictetus's ancient wisdom about the difference between what we can and cannot control dissolves into something much softer. Just the gentle recognition that strength and tenderness were never opposites, but rather different expressions of the same flowing current that moves through all human experience. And as these ideas drift deeper into the texture of sleep itself, there's no need to hold on to anything we've explored together, no need to remember the techniques or retain the insights, because they're already becoming part of the vast silence where all seeking comes to rest. Where understanding needs no words, only this gentle breathing into what always was and always will be. This space between thoughts where philosophy becomes dream, and dream becomes the timeless rhythm of consciousness itself, carrying you beyond all boundaries into that infinite quiet where questions and answers merge like streams flowing into an endless ocean, until there's only this soft dissolving into wherever these thoughts are taking you, this gentle release into the deep currents of sleep where all wisdom returns to its source.